The lake was long and narrow, a still body of water nestled between dense forest on either side. My wife and I had set up camp about halfway down its length, tucked into a small clearing that gave us direct access to the water. It was the perfect spot, remote, quiet, and untouched. The only way in was by canoe or a long hike through thick woods, which meant we had the place to ourselves. The day had been warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that kept the bugs at bay. We had paddled for hours before settling on this site, pulling the canoe up onto the shore and unpacking our gear. The tent went up without issue, a small fire crackled in the fire pit, and everything felt just as it should, calm, peaceful, the kind of solitude we had come looking for. The sun had dipped below the trees a while ago, and the last light was fading fast. I could hear the soft sound of the water lapping against the shore, a rhythmic, soothing noise that filled the silence of the wilderness. My wife had already crawled into the tent, exhausted from the day's paddling, but I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the night air. Eventually, I decided to wash up before turning in. I grabbed a small towel and walked down to the water's edge. The lake was like glass, perfectly still, reflecting the stars above with stunning clarity. I knelt, scooped up some water, and splashed it over my face, the cold sending a brief shock through me. That's when I saw the lights. Two small, bobbing headlamps on the far side of the lake, maybe 50 meters away. The distance wasn't much, and with the night being so still, sound carried easily across the water. The lights moved slowly, uncertainly. At first, I assumed they belonged to another pair of campers who had set up on the opposite shore. It wasn't unheard of for people to camp in unofficial spots, though it was rare out here. But then, as I watched, the lights dimmed, flickered, and then, one after the other, they went out entirely. The darkness swallowed the far shore, leaving no sign that anyone had ever been there. A few seconds passed. The silence stretched. Then I heard it, a deep, heavy snort. It came from the same direction the lights had been, a rough, guttural sound that cut through the quiet. It was loud, too loud to be anything small. I knew that noise. It was either a moose or a bear. And whichever it was big. I stayed still, listening. Another loud snort. Then a rustling, something moving through the underbrush. I didn't have a flashlight with me, only the dim glow of the fire back at camp, so I couldn't see anything on the opposite shore. But I could hear it, whatever it was, shifting in the dark. I hesitated for a moment, then called out, my voice carrying easily over the still water. "Hey, are you all right?" Silence. Then, after a pause, a voice, muffled, distant, but definitely human. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that whoever was over there had heard me. I waited, listening, until I heard them call back again, louder this time. I understood enough to piece it together. They were lost. I grabbed my flashlight from near the tent and shined it across the water. It was too far to see clearly, but I could just make out two figures standing at the tree line. No fire, no tent, just the two of them, stranded in the dark. I walked back to the canoe, still pulled up on shore, and pushed it into the water. I wasn't about to leave them over there, not with whatever was lurking in the woods. Paddling across was easy in the still water, the blade cutting cleanly with each stroke. As I neared the far shore, the two figures came into focus, two hikers, young, probably in their 20s. They looked exhausted, their gear haphazardly slung over their backs. One of them had a headlamp in his hand, clicking the button repeatedly, but nothing happened. I beached the canoe and gestured for them to get in. They didn't hesitate. Whatever was in the woods behind them was enough to make them trust a complete stranger. The paddleback was quiet. They sat in the canoe, tense, listening. I kept an ear out, too, half expecting to hear movement on the shore, but there was nothing. The moment we reached my campsite, they scrambled out, grateful to be anywhere but on that side of the lake. I handed them a spare flashlight, and they immediately set to work pitching their tent. It was clear they were relieved. If I hadn't been here, they would have had no choice but to hike for hours in the dark, completely blind, hoping to stumble upon another campsite. I didn't ask too many questions. They were tired, grateful, and I could tell they just wanted to get some rest. I let them be, stoked the fire a little, and eventually crawled into my own tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The night passed without further incident. No more strange noises, no more unseen animals snorting in the dark. Just the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees. By morning, the lake was calm as ever, the previous night's tension nothing more than a fading memory. The two hikers were up early, already packing their gear. I could tell they were eager to move on, to put last night behind them. As they set off down the trail, I watched them go, disappearing into the trees. The lake was quiet again, the forest still, and just like that, it was as if they had never been there at all. Vermont's long trail had been on my list for a while. 70 miles wasn't the whole thing, but it was enough. A solid stretch through some of the most rugged, remote terrain in the state, up and down ridgelines, deep in thick forests, crossing rocky streams and muddy lowlands. I had planned for this hike, prepped for it, thought I had everything dialed in. But there are some mistakes you don't realize you've made until you're too far in to fix them easily. It had been raining on and off for a day and a half by the time the real trouble started. Summer in Vermont meant humidity that clung to you like a second skin, and after all that rain, the forest was thick with it. The air was heavy, damp, unrelenting. Every piece of clothing I had was sticking to me in some way, but at first, it was just an inconvenience. My pack was holding up fine, my boots were soaked but doing their job, and the miles were ticking by at a steady pace. It wasn't until midday on the second day that I felt the first signs of trouble. A little bit of irritation, nothing major. Just a slight rawness between my legs, like a mild sunburn in an inconvenient place. I ignored it. The trail was slow going, thick with roots and rocks, and every few steps my boots slipped in the mud. I kept pushing forward, figuring the discomfort would pass. But it didn't. It got worse. By mid-afternoon, the irritation had turned into something more. A deep, burning chafe spreading through my inner thighs and up into my crotch, the kind of pain that doesn't let up, no matter how you walk. My boxer briefs, Cap-Eileen moisture-wicking, supposedly great for hiking, had turned into sandpaper. Every step ground them against my skin like a slow, deliberate punishment. Still, I pushed forward. The only way out was through. By evening, I was in hell. The heat and humidity made everything worse. My skin was raw, inflamed, every movement sending waves of pain radiating through me. I tried adjusting my stride, shifting the way my thighs moved, anything to lessen the friction, but nothing helped. I was walking bow-legged, looking more like an old cowboy than a backpacker. That night, setting up camp was an ordeal. I stripped down in my tent and assessed the damage by the light of my headlamp. It wasn't pretty. Red, angry skin, patches that looked on the verge of blistering. I dug through my med kit, hoping for some kind of miracle, but we had nothing that would help. No anti-chafing cream, no Vaseline, not even a tube of antibiotic ointment. Desperate, I got creative. I took a bandana from my pack and folded it into a makeshift sling, tying the ends to my belt so that everything sensitive was lifted and cradled in its own separate little hammock. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The next morning, I walked like a man with a serious problem. Bow-legged, stiff, every step calculated to minimize contact. My hiking partner, who had been nothing but supportive so far, was clearly trying not to laugh. But it was no joke. Every mile was agony. The trail stretched on, mile after mile of damp, humid forest, the occasional steep climb making things even worse. I stopped when I could, adjusting the bandana, but there was no real relief. The chafing had reached a level where even standing still hurt. I just kept moving, fueled by the hope that we'd eventually reach a road. By midday, I was limping. The pain had gone beyond a slow burn. It was searing, sharp, constant. The humidity was unrelenting, sweat pouring down my back, soaking into every inch of fabric. It felt like I was walking through a swamp, and in some ways I was. Every low-lying section of the trail was thick with mud, puddles stretching across the path, no way around them. I had long since stopped trying to keep my boots dry. Then finally we saw it. A road. It wasn't much, just a narrow strip of pavement cutting through the trees, but it meant civilization. And sitting just off to the side, nestled under a canopy of trees, was a small general store. The kind of place you pray has exactly what you need, even if you don't know what that is yet. I shuffled inside, scanning the shelves, looking for anything that might offer relief. And then I saw it, behind the counter. A tiny metal tin, green and gold, unassuming but unmistakable. Bag balm. Originally made for treating chafed cow udders, but as any seasoned hiker knows, it works wonders on human skin too. I grabbed it, paid, and didn't waste a second. I barely made it around the side of the building before I had my pants down, scooping out a thick glob of the medicated ointment and slathering it everywhere that needed it. The relief was instant. A cool, soothing balm against the fire that had been raging between my legs for the last 24 hours. I stood there, letting it soak in, and for the first time since the chafing had started, I felt like I could breathe. The rest of the trip was a dream compared to what had come before. The bag balm did its job, cutting the pain down to a manageable level, letting my skin heal with each passing mile. The humidity didn't seem as oppressive anymore. The miles didn't seem as long. By the time we reached the end of our route, I felt almost normal again. Lesson learned. Some mistakes you only make once. Philmont was everything I had imagined, rugged, wild, and completely unforgiving. The kind of place that made you feel small in the best possible way. We were deep into our trek, miles away from anything resembling civilization, and our crew had settled into a rhythm. Wake up early, break down camp, eat a quick breakfast, and hit the trail. Every day was different, but they all followed the same basic structure. Hike, set up camp, cook, bear bags up, sleep, repeat. On this particular morning, we had a simple plan. A side hike to the commissary to pick up food while the rest of our crew stayed back at camp. It was supposed to be an easy errand, a few miles down a well-used trail, grab supplies, and head back before the sun got too high. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing difficult. It started like any other hike, packs cinched tight, boots kicking up dust, the smell of pine thick in the air. The trail was well-worn, winding through rolling hills, thick clusters of ponderosa pines rising high on either side. The morning sun filtered through the branches, dappling the ground with golden light. Everything was still damp from the night before, the smell of wet earth hanging in the air. The first few miles passed quickly. We kept a steady pace, moving with the kind of ease that comes from days of hiking. Muscles sore but used to it, feet aching but strong. It was the kind of walk that lets your mind wander. I found myself thinking about the next camp, about the food we'd be picking up, anything to pass the time. And then we turned a corner. The moment I saw it, every thought emptied from my head. A bear. Massive. Just sitting there in the middle of the trail like it owned the place. It wasn't moving. It wasn't eating. It wasn't doing anything. Just sitting, like some kind of stone statue, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. Everything in my body screamed to stop, and I did. I stopped so hard that the guy behind me almost ran into me. My stomach dropped, my skin went cold, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Bears were a known risk at Philmont. We had done all the training, learned all the rules. Make noise, keep food locked away, hang everything in bear bags. But knowing all that and seeing one in front of you were two very different things. For a moment, none of us moved. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on us, holding us in place. I could hear the faint rustling of trees, the occasional chirp of a bird, but everything else was silent. The bear wasn't looking at us, but that didn't make me feel any better. Then slowly we backed off, step by step, careful, measured. Not turning our backs, not making any sudden movements, just putting distance between us and it. We stopped when we were out of sight, just around the bend. My brain was still trying to process what had just happened, but we had a bigger problem now. The bear was right in the middle of the only trail leading to the commissary. There was no way around, no side path, no easy detour. If we wanted to get the food, we had to go forward, and that meant moving past the bear. There was no good option. Waiting wasn't realistic. We didn't know how long it would stay there, and standing around in bear country wasn't exactly a great plan either. Going back to camp empty-handed wasn't an option. So we did the only thing we could do. We made noise. A lot of it. We clapped, we stomped, we banged our trekking poles together. Anything to make our presence known without actually seeing it. The last thing we wanted was to surprise it up close. My heart was pounding the entire time. The idea of rounding that corner and seeing it still sitting there, or worse, coming toward us, had my nerves stretched thin. But when we finally worked up the courage to move forward, the trail was empty. The bear was gone. Not far, I was sure. Probably somewhere in the trees, watching, waiting. But it wasn't blocking our path anymore, and that was enough. We moved fast, hearts still racing, heads on a swivel, scanning every shadow, every movement in the trees. The rest of the hike to the commissary was a blur. My legs felt shaky, my mouth dry, but we kept going. When we finally reached it, the normalcy of the place, people loading food into bags, the chatter of hikers swapping stories, felt strange, like I had stepped into another world. The way back was quicker. We weren't taking chances, moving with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the bushes had my stomach clenching, my pulse jumping. But we made it back to camp without seeing the bear again. That night, as I lay in my tent, I kept thinking about it. The sheer size of it. The way it had just been there, as if it had been waiting for us. We had done everything right. We had backed away, made noise, avoided confrontation. But the thing that stuck with me the most was how little control we had really had over the situation. The bear had moved when it wanted to move, not because of anything we had done. If it had decided to stay, if it had decided to come toward us instead of vanishing into the trees, there wouldn't have been a thing we could do about it. That thought stayed with me long after the trip ended. Philmont was wild in a way that most places weren't. The mountains, the forests, the open stretches of land, it all belonged to nature, not to us. And out there, we weren't in charge. We were just passing through. Summer camp was supposed to be one of those experiences you never forget. A week of hiking, swimming, campfires, and everything else that came with being out in the woods. I had been in scouts for a while, so I knew the routine. Set up your tent, keep your gear dry, and make sure your food was stored away from camp unless you wanted animals rummaging through your stuff. It was second nature by now. But that year, something was different. The first night seemed normal enough. We had spent the day hiking, setting up camp, and going through the usual evening routine. By the time we turned in for the night, I was exhausted. The ground was hard, but I was used to it. The sounds of the forest, crickets, wind through the trees, were just background noise at this point. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and drifted off. Then I woke up. Outside. I didn't understand at first. I was groggy, my body stiff with cold, and the sky above me was open and full of stars. For a second, I thought maybe I had just left the tent flap open. But no, the tent was a few feet away, zipped shut. My sleeping bag was still fully around me, meaning I hadn't crawled out. I was just outside. Confused, I sat up and looked around. The camp was quiet, the only movement coming from the wind pushing through the trees. My heart was pounding, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I had rolled out somehow. Maybe I had pushed myself under the tent wall without realizing it. But that didn't make sense. There was a metal rod staked into the ground right where the tent's side met the dirt, a support for the structure. If I had rolled out, I would have hit it. Hard. I would have woken up. I didn't remember anything. No dream, no tossing and turning. Just the feeling of going to sleep inside the tent and waking up outside of it. I unzipped the tent and crawled back in, trying to push it out of my mind. It was weird, sure, but I was exhausted, and exhaustion made people do strange things. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The second night, it happened again. This time, I woke up even farther from the tent, maybe 5 or 6 feet away. The sky was still dark, the air cool against my face. My sleeping bag was still zipped up around me, just like before. My hands were stiff from the cold, my legs sore. I sat up fast, my heart racing. This wasn't normal. I looked toward the tent. The flap was shut. The other guys inside were still asleep. I listened for any noise in the woods, any sign that something had happened, but everything was still. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I was sleepwalking, even though I had never done it before. But even if I had somehow managed to unzip the tent, climb out in my sleeping bag, and move several feet without waking up, it still didn't explain how I had done it so smoothly. No drag marks in the dirt, no sign of struggle. It was like I had just been placed there. I climbed back inside the tent, making sure I was fully inside this time. I tried to sleep, but I kept jerking awake every time I started drifting off. I had this uneasy feeling, like I was waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I kept quiet about it. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I told myself it was just in my head, maybe some weird mix of exhaustion and stress. But then it happened again, and again, every single night. I tried everything to stop it. I positioned myself so that my back was against the tent wall. I stuffed my backpack beside me as a barrier. I even tried tying the sleeping bag's zipper to a loop on my belt, thinking maybe that would keep me inside. Nothing worked. Every night, I woke up outside. It got worse, too. By the fourth night, I was waking up even farther from the tent. 15 feet, 20 feet. I started finding twigs and leaves stuck to my sleeping bag, dirt smeared on the fabric. It was like I had been dragged, but there were never any marks in the dirt. No sign of movement. Just me lying there, completely still. I started to panic. If I had been rolling out, there would be signs. If someone had moved me, I would have woken up. But there was nothing, no sound, no memory, no explanation. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, my heart would start racing, and I'd jolt awake, terrified I was about to be moved again. I kept my hand clenched around my flashlight, gripping it so tightly that my knuckles hurt in the morning. On the last night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sleep. I forced myself to stay awake as long as I could, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of the other guys inside. My eyes burned, my body ached, but I didn't care. I needed to know. At some point, though, exhaustion won. My eyelids got heavier, my grip on the flashlight loosened. I didn't even remember falling asleep. But when I woke up, I was outside. Again, only this time, I was at the edge of the clearing. I had never been that far before. The tent was just a dark shape in the distance, the trees behind me looming tall, their trunks stretching up into the sky. My sleeping bag was cold and damp, covered in dew. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought I might throw up. I scrambled to my feet, shaking. I spun around, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees and silence. I ran back to the tent. The next morning, I packed my gear as fast as I could. When we left camp, I didn't look back. I don't know what happened that week. I don't know how I ended up outside night after night. Maybe it was something I did without realizing. Maybe it was something else. I'll probably never have an answer. But I know one thing for sure. I don't want to go back. Killarney Provincial Park was supposed to be the highlight of my last year of summer camp. A full 7-day canoeing and hiking trip through some of the most rugged, beautiful terrain in Ontario. We had planned everything to the smallest detail. The route, the campsites, the food, even emergency plans. It was meant to be a perfect send-off, a final challenge before aging out of the program. It turned out to be one of the most stressful, unpredictable, and exhausting trips I've ever taken. The first day started like most do, packing up gear, loading the canoes, double-checking supplies. It was early morning when we set out, the water calm, the sun just beginning to rise. The first few hours of paddling were peaceful, even enjoyable. The lake stretched out endlessly, reflecting the trees like glass, the silence broken only by the dipping of paddles and the occasional call of a loon. We made good time, stopping for a quick lunch before pressing on. The first portage was rougher than expected, uneven, full of roots, and longer than it looked on the map. But we managed. That's how the first day went. Just grinding forward, taking the trip one lake at a time, one trail at a time. We set up camp near a quiet bay, well away from any other groups. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the lake water was cold and clear. We ate fast, exhausted, and settled in for the night. The second day took us deep into the park, navigating narrow waterways and rocky portages. By late afternoon, we had climbed a long, winding trail that opened up to a hilltop view. That's when we saw them. A couple stood near the edge of the trail, their 2 dogs darting back and forth barking. At first, I thought they were just letting their dogs run loose. Then I noticed what they were barking at. A black bear, backed up against a small stand of trees. That alone was enough to make me uneasy, but then I saw the real problem. 2 cubs at the top of those trees. The mother bear was trapped, cornered. The dogs were going nuts, circling and lunging. The couple seemed oblivious, laughing as if it was all just some casual wildlife encounter. My stomach clenched. The only thing more dangerous than a black bear is a mother black bear with cubs. If she decided to charge, those dogs wouldn't stand a chance, and if she chased them toward us, we wouldn't either. We backed away immediately. I didn't want to be anywhere near that situation when it went bad. I don't know what happened to the couple or their dogs. We left fast, not looking back. By day 3, the trip was wearing on us. The portages were getting harder, the packs heavier. Every muscle ached. We spent most of the day paddling, making our way toward a long portage that would take us to the next lake, where we planned to camp. It was supposed to be a routine stretch, just another day of paddling and hiking. Then we saw the smoke. It was faint at first, just a thin column rising in the distance. Then we heard the sound, low, droning, mechanical. Minutes later, a firebomber flew overhead, a massive plane dipping down toward the lake. It passed right over us, disappearing beyond the trees. Then another, and another. The smoke was coming from the direction we were headed. We watched as the planes dropped their loads, huge plumes of water crashing down into the forest. The realization hit all of us at once. The fire was right where we needed to go. Turning back wasn't an option. There were no camping spots on the lake we were on, no place to stop. We were stuck. We paddled on, cautious, unsure of what we'd find. As we got closer, the air smelled of smoke, the sky hazy. Embers floated on the water, carried by the breeze. The fire had burned right through our route, the portage trail still smoldering. With nowhere else to go, we searched for anything, an outcrop, a clearing, anything to keep us off the water for the night. That's when we found it, an abandoned cabin on a small island. It was old, the wood gray and weathered, half hidden by trees. There was no sign of recent use, no boats, no trails. But at that moment, it was a lifeline. We beached the canoes and explored cautiously. The cabin was empty, mostly intact. A broken-down stove, a few rusted tools. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We spent the night there, taking turns keeping watch. The fire wasn't close enough to be an immediate danger, but the thought of it creeping toward us kept us awake. At first light, we didn't waste any time. We packed up and pushed toward the portage. The trail was still warm, the ground blackened and ashy. Smoke curled from fallen logs, the trees scorched but still standing. Every step sent up tiny clouds of soot. We moved fast, stepping over burnt branches, avoiding weak ground. It was eerie, silent except for the occasional creak of cooling wood. The fire was out, but it had passed through fast, leaving behind only charred remains. By midday, we reached the next lake. The air was clearer there, the water cool. We pushed on, exhausted but relieved to be past the burn. We eventually circled back toward the lake where we had seen the bears, planning to spend our final night there. But as we arrived, something was wrong. Every campsite was marked with warning signs. Bear activity. Do not camp. That was all we needed to see. No one argued, no one hesitated. We turned back immediately. The sun was already low, and we had to move fast if we wanted to reach another site before dark. The final stretch was brutal. We paddled hard, pushing through exhaustion, every muscle screaming. The sun dipped below the trees, the sky darkening. The air cooled, the sound of water and paddles the only thing keeping me focused. Finally, just as the last light was fading, we reached another site. It wasn't ideal, rocky, cramped, but at that point we didn't care. We made camp in silence, too tired to talk. The fire burned low, the embers glowing. That night, I lay awake, listening to the wind, the distant call of a loon, the rustling of the trees. The bears, the fire, the endless miles of trail. It all blurred together. The last day was a grind. Every mile felt longer, every stroke of the paddle heavier. But the thought of finishing pushed us forward. By late afternoon, we reached the final stretch, a long, slow paddle back to the starting point. When we finally saw the dock, the relief was overwhelming. We climbed out, muscles stiff, legs weak. The week had taken its toll, but we had made it. As we packed up, I looked back at the lake. The water was calm again, the forest still. It was hard to believe what we had just been through. 7 days in Killarney. I'll never forget it. I've done a lot of camping trips, but I've never had an experience like this before. It happened in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in Idaho, a massive, untouched expanse of deep forests, rugged mountains, and twisting rivers. Some of the most remote terrain in the lower 48 states. This wasn't my first time in the area. I'd hiked through these forests before, and I'd camped solo plenty of times. I wasn't afraid of the dark, of being alone, or of the isolation. But by the end of this trip, I would be. I started my hike in the late morning. The weather was perfect. Cool air, clear skies, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. The plan was simple. A 3-day solo trip through a lesser-known section of the wilderness, camping at 2 separate spots along the way. This area wasn't heavily trafficked, especially after mid-September. The summer hikers were gone, and hunting season hadn't started yet. That meant no one would be around. I followed a narrow, winding trail deep into the forest, crossing streams and climbing over fallen logs. The further I went, the quieter it got. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots, the occasional rustle of squirrels, and the distant call of a raven. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, an open clearing near a small, slow-moving creek. The spot was perfect. A soft patch of dirt for my tent, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and no signs of anyone else having camped here recently. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got a small blaze going before the sun set. After a quick meal of dehydrated chili, I leaned back against a log and watched the flames flicker, feeling completely at peace. But that was the last time I felt safe. I woke up sometime in the night. Something had startled me. I listened, heart pounding in the silence. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The forest was dead quiet, too quiet. I lay there, every nerve on edge. Then I heard it. A soft rustling. Slow. Deliberate. It was coming from just beyond the light of the embers, somewhere in the trees. I sat up slowly, straining to see into the darkness. The sound stopped. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. Then, after a long, tense minute, I convinced myself it had just been an animal, a raccoon maybe, a deer moving through the brush. I turned off the light and lay back down. But it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and froze. Something was wrong. My firewood was gone. Not just scattered or moved, completely gone. The pile I had gathered last night vanished. I frowned, looking around. Maybe an animal had dragged it off? But that didn't make sense. Animals might scatter wood, but they wouldn't take all of it. I checked the area, but there were no tracks. I felt a little uneasy, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just misremembering. I made breakfast, packed up my gear, and set off for my next campsite, about 10 miles deeper into the wilderness. I didn't know it yet, but I wouldn't make it that far. I hiked for hours, following the trail as it climbed through dense forest and over rocky ridges. The deeper I went, the more unsettled I felt. The silence was wrong. No birds, no insects, not even the wind in the trees. Just the sound of my own breathing and the steady crunch of my boots. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a break. I dropped my pack beside a fallen tree, drank some water, and checked my map. Then I noticed something strange. The dirt on the trail, it looked different, like someone had walked here recently. I knelt down, studying the ground. The prints weren't sharp enough to make out details, but they were there. And they weren't mine. They were fresh. I scanned the forest, suddenly feeling watched. But the trees stood still, the shadows unbroken. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe a hunter scouting the area early. But I didn't believe it, because if someone else was out here, where were they now? By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a ridge, another good campsite. But something about the place felt off. I couldn't explain it, just a deep, gut-level unease. The air felt heavy, the silence too complete. But the sun was getting low, and I didn't want to keep hiking in the dark. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, started a fire, tried to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I woke up again. Something was outside my tent. Not an animal, not the wind, something big. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate exhale. Just inches from my tent. Someone was there, standing over me, breathing. I grabbed my knife, my fingers slick with sweat. And then silence. I lay there, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. An hour. Maybe more. I don't know when I finally fell asleep. I woke up at dawn, and everything was gone. My tent, my backpack, my gear, all of it. I scrambled to my feet, my mind reeling. The fire was out. The ground where my tent had been was undisturbed, like I had never been there at all. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. I spun in circles, searching the clearing. No footprints. No drag marks. No sign that I had ever camped here. I was alone. No food. No water. No gear. And I was 10 miles from the nearest road. I didn't think. I just ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, lungs burning. I don't know how long I ran before I hit the trail again, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out. Ran until I could see the sun filtering through the trees, promising safety, promising escape. I didn't stop until I reached the road. A group of campers found me hours later, sitting by the side of the road, shaking and barefoot. They took me to a ranger station. I told them everything. They hiked back to where my campsite should have been. They found nothing. No sign of my tent. No sign of a fire. No footprints. Nothing. Like I had never been there. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know how they took everything without making a sound, or why they left me alive. But I do know this. I will never camp alone again. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. I had planned everything down to the smallest detail: a 12-mile loop through the mountains, a night at a scenic ridge, and a return to my car by noon the next day. Nothing difficult, nothing dangerous. But somewhere along the way, I took the wrong trail. And it almost killed me. I started the hike early in the morning. The air was cool, the forest alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The first few miles were easy, the trail winding steadily upward through thick trees, crossing small streams and climbing gentle ridges. The map showed a clearly marked fork about 5 miles in. Left would take me to my planned campsite. Right would lead down into a valley. When I reached the fork, I barely hesitated. I turned left, confident in my navigation. It would take me nearly 2 hours to realize my mistake. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The trail was a little narrower than I expected, a little more overgrown, but I figured it was just an older path. The elevation climbed steadily, and the trees started to thin out. After another mile, I reached a small clearing and checked my map. Something wasn't right. The ridgeline ahead of me didn't match the one I was supposed to be following. The stream I had passed 20 minutes ago wasn't on the map. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. The trail behind me looked less distinct than I remembered. And that's when it hit me. I had taken the wrong path. I didn't panic. Not yet. I knew I was still heading in the general direction of my planned route. I decided to keep going, figuring I could cut across to the correct trail. That was my second mistake. I hiked another mile. The trail got worse, narrower, the ground rockier, harder to navigate. The trees thinned out completely, and I found myself on an exposed slope, loose gravel shifting beneath my boots. Then I saw it, a trail marker, a simple wooden post with a faded sign nailed to it. For the first time, real unease crept in. The sign wasn't weathered. It was burned, charred black, like it had been set on fire. The only thing still visible was a single arrow, pointing downhill. I hesitated. Something about that burned sign bothered me. But I needed to get back to the right trail, and this was the first clear marker I had seen in miles. I followed the arrow. The path descended sharply, winding through rocky outcrops and dry, brittle brush. The air grew hotter, heavier. The scent of pine faded, replaced by something stale. Then I noticed something strange. The silence. The birds were gone. No wind. No rustling leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing. By the time I realized how far I had gone, it was too late to turn back. The trail had narrowed to a single rocky ledge, steep drops on both sides. My only choice was to keep moving forward. The landscape had changed completely. No trees, just jagged rocks and dry, crumbling earth. And then I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was a shelter, a structure built from stacked stones. But as I got closer, my stomach tightened. It wasn't a shelter. It was a wall, a man-made wall blocking the trail. And just like the sign, it was burned. I stopped several feet away, my breath coming fast. The wall was about 6 feet high, made of stacked rocks and blackened wood. The center had collapsed inward, leaving a dark opening. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to keep something out. It was meant to keep something in. I stood there for a long moment, debating. Then I heard it, a sound from the other side of the wall. A single footstep. I turned and ran. I didn't care if I was going the wrong way. I just needed to get away. I ran uphill, scrambling over loose rock, lungs burning. My only thought was to get back to the trees. But the trail was gone. I had no idea which direction I had come from. The rocky landscape all looked the same. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. A person. My heart leapt. I shouted, waving an arm. But as soon as I did, the figure disappeared behind a ridge. I ran after them. I crested the ridge, expecting to see someone just ahead. But there was no one. Just a long, sloping valley of scorched earth. The sun was getting low. Shadows stretched long across the cracked ground. I had no food, no water, and no idea where I was. I needed to find shelter. I climbed down into the valley, hoping it would lead back to familiar ground. The deeper I went, the worse the landscape got. Dead trees, burned stumps, blackened soil. It looked like there had been a fire here, but there were no signs of regrowth. Like nothing had lived here for a very long time. Then I saw something half buried in the dirt. I knelt and brushed the soil away. It was a boot, a hiking boot, and it was new. I stared at it, my pulse hammering. There was no sign of a body, no tracks leading away, just the single boot. I stood up, trying to calm my breathing. I needed to get out of this valley. Then behind me, A sound. A whisper. I spun around, heart pounding. There was nothing there. Just the wind, finally returning, stirring the ash-like dust at my feet. Then, in the distance, a flicker of movement. Something coming over the ridge. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. The landscape blurred past me, the ground uneven, treacherous. I tripped, fell, scrambled back up. My lungs felt like they were on fire. Then, I saw trees. Real trees. Green, untouched by whatever had happened in that valley. I sprinted toward them, crashing through the undergrowth, branches clawing at my face. And suddenly, I was back on a trail. A real marked trail. I gasped for air, barely able to believe it. Then I saw the sign. The same burned sign, pointing downhill. I don't remember much after that. I ran until I couldn't anymore. At some point, I stumbled onto the correct trail. A group of hikers found me hours later, exhausted, dehydrated, barely able to speak. They took me back to the ranger station. When I told them where I had been, they looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no trail out there," one of them said. "No old walls. No valley." I tried to argue, but they just shook their heads. "You must have gotten turned around. But I know what I saw. And I know one thing for sure. I took the wrong trail. And I don't think I was supposed to come back." I always loved camping alone. Some people find the idea terrifying, being deep in the wilderness, no one around, just the trees, the wind, and the distant sounds of nature. But to me, it was peaceful. That's why, when I had a rare weekend off, I packed my gear and headed to a remote campsite in the mountains. A place where few people ventured, far from roads and crowded parks. I planned to stay for 2 nights, completely alone. Or at least, that's what I thought. By the second night, I was certain I was not alone. And by the time I left, I wasn't even sure if I had been awake or dreaming. Because the tents I saw that night, they were never really there. The hike to the campsite took most of the day. The trail was steep, winding through dense forest, then opening up to a high, rocky plateau with a small lake at its center. The perfect place to set up camp. I reached the lake by late afternoon, found a flat area near the water, and pitched my one-person tent. The air was crisp, the sky clear. No one else in sight. Exactly what I wanted. After setting up, I ate a quick meal, then wandered around the lake, enjoying the quiet. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. The sun dipped lower, and I made a small fire near my tent. That's when I noticed it. A flicker of movement, far across the lake. A brief shimmer, like light reflecting off fabric. I squinted, but the sun was setting, and the trees cast long shadows. I saw nothing else. Still, for the first time on this trip, I felt uneasy. Night fell. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the woods. An owl hooted. Something rustled in the brush. Normal wilderness noises. I tried to shake off the weird feeling from earlier. But when I glanced across the lake again, I froze. There were tents. 3 of them. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I leaned forward, heart pounding. They were faintly illuminated by the rising moon, positioned in a small clearing at the far side of the lake. I hadn't seen or heard anyone arrive. No sounds of footsteps, no voices, no flashlights. Just suddenly tents. I told myself I must have missed them earlier, that they had been there all along. Still, I felt an unsettling chill. I watched for movement. No shadows shifting inside the tents, no one walking near them. No sounds at all. It was almost too quiet. I wanted to dismiss it, go to sleep, forget about it. But something about those tents bothered me. Something I couldn't put into words. I barely slept. I kept waking up, ears straining in the silence. Listening. Around midnight, I unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light around my camp. And across the lake, the tents were still there. But something was different. There were now 4. My stomach tightened. I was certain, absolutely certain, that there had been only 3 before. I sat there, frozen, staring at the distant tents. Still no movement. Still no sound. I tried to convince myself I had counted wrong earlier, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew. Something wasn't right. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Then a noise. A soft flapping sound, like fabric moving in the wind. My eyes snapped open. The air was still. No wind. I listened, holding my breath. The sound was close. Right outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, heart hammering. Slowly, I unzipped the flap, just an inch, and shined the beam outside. Nothing. Just my campfire, now only glowing embers. And across the lake, the tents were gone. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, my mind racing. I had just seen them. I knew they were there. But now only dark, empty forest. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I dreaming? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. And then, from the woods behind me, a whisper. I spun around, flashlight shaking. The beam cut through the trees, revealing only shifting shadows. But I had heard it. A soft, breath-like whisper. Close. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. I needed to get out of here. But hiking in the dark, miles from my car? Too dangerous. I told myself to wait until morning, that I'd be safe in my tent. I was wrong. I barely slept, every sound setting me on edge. Sometime before dawn, I must have drifted off. Then suddenly, a soft tapping, right outside my tent. I shot upright, blood pounding. The tap came again. 1, 2, 3. A slow, deliberate pattern. I couldn't breathe. Then, a sound from across the lake. I turned my head, heart hammering, and I saw them. The tents, back in the clearing. But this time there were 5. I didn't think. I acted. I grabbed my boots, shoved them on, ripped open my tent, and bolted. The cold air hit me like a slap. The forest was silent. No wind. No birds. I ran without looking back. Branches tore at my arms as I stumbled through the trees, my flashlight bobbing wildly. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I reached my car just as the sun was rising. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. I floored it, speeding down the winding mountain road, not stopping until I was miles away. Only then did I finally look back. Through the trees, in the distance. I swear I saw them. A row of tents. Perfectly still. Perfectly silent. Exactly where they shouldn't be. And just before I lost sight of them, one of the tent flaps slowly opened. I never went back. I checked maps, park records. No official campsites existed in that area. No reports of other hikers. And no one could explain what I saw. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know one thing for certain. Somewhere, deep in those woods, the tents are still there. Waiting. I've always felt comfortable in the woods. Some people get nervous out there, alone among the trees, miles from civilization, where the sounds of the modern world fade away. But for me, the solitude was calming. It was the one place I felt truly at peace. Until that night. Until I saw him. After that, I could never step into the woods again without feeling like I was being watched. It started as a simple solo camping trip. I had done dozens before. Find a remote spot, set up camp, enjoy a weekend of peace. This time, I chose a dense forest area in the mountains, far from popular trails. I wanted isolation. I got something else. The first day was uneventful. I hiked for hours, following an unmarked game trail deep into the woods. Eventually, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. A stream ran nearby, providing fresh water. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal as the sun dipped below the trees. Everything felt normal, peaceful. But as I sat by the fire that night, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Like I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my imagination. That I had been alone in the woods too many times to let my mind play tricks on me. But that feeling, that creeping unease, wouldn't go away. I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, expecting to see something moving. But there was nothing. Just endless trees, shifting shadows, and the distant sounds of the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. I forced myself to go to sleep. Curled up in my tent, I listened to the quiet hum of the woods. Crickets chirped, branches rustled in the wind. It should have been comforting. But then silence. Sudden and absolute. The crickets stopped. The wind stilled. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the unnatural quiet. Then a sound. Faint. Distant. Footsteps. They were slow. Deliberate. Crunching through the undergrowth, just beyond the reach of my campfire's glow. I held my breath. A deer? A bear? No. This was different. These were human footsteps. I grabbed the knife from my pack and sat up, every muscle tensed. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in around me. I waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Nothing. Finally, I lay back down, gripping the knife tight. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been alone in the woods too many times to let fear take hold. But deep down I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found footprints outside my camp. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Human. Someone had been standing near my tent, watching me. I scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. But that feeling of being watched was stronger now. I considered packing up and leaving. But part of me didn't want to let fear win. So I made a decision. I would stay. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to shake the unease. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, preparing for another night. That's when I saw it. Something carved into a tree near my tent. A single word. Leave. My stomach turned. The carving was fresh. Someone had done this while I was gone. I scanned the woods, my pulse hammering. Still, no sign of anyone. But I knew they were out there. Watching. Waiting. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the trees. The silence was thick. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Then movement. A shadow. Tall. Human. Standing just at the edge of the firelight. Watching me. I shot to my feet, knife raised. Who's there? I called, my voice hoarse. No answer. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, heart hammering. And just like that, it was gone. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my gear in record time, my hands shaking, every nerve screaming for me to run. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the tree where the word had been carved. There was something new beneath it. Another word, carved with deep, jagged cuts. Stay. I don't remember the hike back to my car. I just remember the terror, the certainty that I was being followed. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors and sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if he was still there. Watching. Waiting. I never went back to that forest. Never told anyone what happened, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I still feel it. That same awful sensation. The certainty that someone is watching me. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see him, standing at the edge of the firelight, silent, waiting, and I know, he's still out there. I had always loved hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. It had always been comforting to me. But this hike was different. This trail shouldn't have existed, and I wish I had never set foot on it. It was late autumn, just before the first snowfall. I had planned a 3-day solo hike through a remote forest, no marked trails, just old logging roads and game paths. I had done it before. I wasn't worried, but this time something was off. From the very beginning, the woods felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. I had been walking for about 5 hours when I first saw the trail. It wasn't on my map. A narrow, winding path, barely visible beneath fallen leaves, disappearing into the dense trees. It looked old, forgotten. A part of me knew I should ignore it, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about it pulled me in. So I stepped off my planned route and onto the trail. That was my first mistake. At first, it seemed normal. The path twisted through the trees, uneven but well-trodden. But as I walked, things began to change. The air felt heavier. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. The forest, already silent, became even quieter. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. And then, the path split. 2 identical trails stretched ahead, left or right, both winding deeper into the trees. I hesitated. There was no sign of where they led. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly. Impossible. I shook it, tapped the glass. The needle continued to spin, like it had lost all sense of direction. That was the moment I should have turned back. But I didn't. Instead, I chose the left path. Second mistake. I walked for what felt like hours. But the scenery never changed. Same gnarled trees. Same thick undergrowth. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Then ahead, a clearing. And in the center, a cabin. It was old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging under the weight of time. The windows were black, empty. A door hung slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I stepped closer. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here for years. And yet, the door had been left open, like someone was waiting for me. I didn't go inside. Something about that cabin filled me with a deep, instinctive dread. So I turned back toward the trail and froze, because the path I had just walked was gone, vanished. The trees stood unbroken, like no trail had ever existed. Panic surged through me. I spun in a circle, heart hammering. The trees pressed in too close. The clearing felt smaller, like the forest was closing in around me. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to get out. I picked a direction and started walking. But no matter which way I went, I always ended up back at the cabin. By the third time, my hands were shaking. This was wrong. Impossible. I tried marking the trees, scraping the bark with my knife. But when I passed by again, the marks were gone, as if I had never made them. I screamed into the trees. The sound was swallowed by the silence. I was trapped. Night fell too quickly. The sky went from dull gray to inky black within minutes. The cabin loomed in the darkness. I had no choice. I had to go inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside was stale, rotten. Dust hung in the air, thick as smoke. A single wooden chair sat in the center of the room. On it, a notebook. I picked it up with trembling hands. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting. The same words over and over. The trail doesn't let you leave. The trail doesn't let you leave. The trail doesn't let you leave. The last page had something different. A single line, scrawled in shaking letters. It watches. A sound. Behind me. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. I turned, every muscle locked in fear. And I saw. Nothing. Just the dark doorway. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something was out there. Waiting. Watching. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the cabin, clutching my knife, waiting for the sun. When dawn finally broke, the clearing looked different. And the trail was back, as if it had never disappeared. I ran. I never looked back. Not until I reached my truck, lungs burning, legs trembling. When I finally turned around, the trail was gone. Just solid trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Like it had never existed. Like it had never let me leave. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't even go near those woods. Because sometimes late at night, I still hear it. A whisper, a voice in the wind, calling me back, to the trail that led nowhere. Hiking alone had never scared me before. If anything, I found it peaceful. I've done plenty of solo hikes, remote trails, long distances, even multi-day treks deep in national forests. I always took the necessary precautions. Told someone my route, carried a GPS beacon, packed extra food and water, and kept a knife on me. I respected the wilderness. I wasn't reckless. That's why I didn't panic at first when I heard the sound. I was on the second day of a solo backpacking trip in the Olympic National Park in Washington. The plan was simple: 3 days, 2 nights, a 25-mile loop through some of the most stunning wilderness in the country. It was late September, meaning the summer crowds were gone, and I'd have most of the trail to myself. I'd camped the first night near a quiet stream, miles from any trailhead. The morning had been perfect: crisp air, golden sunlight filtering through moss-covered trees, absolute silence except for birdsong. I packed up my gear, tightened the straps on my pack, and continued deeper into the forest. It wasn't until late afternoon that I heard it for the first time. A single footstep. Not mine. It came from behind me, just far enough away that I couldn't see anything when I turned around. The forest was thick, towering pines and dense undergrowth. Nothing moved. I waited a few seconds, listening. Nothing. Probably just a branch falling, I told myself. Or a squirrel. I kept walking. But a few minutes later, another footstep. This time, it was closer. I spun around fast, heart pounding. No one. The trees stood motionless, the undergrowth undisturbed. My breathing was suddenly loud in my ears. I stayed frozen for a solid minute. Then, finally, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe the sound had been my own footsteps echoing somehow, or an animal shifting in the brush. I kept walking, and that's when it started for real. Every time I moved, it moved. Every time I stopped, it stopped. It was so subtle at first. Just the occasional footstep behind me. A rustling sound. A quick shuffle in the leaves. Always just far enough back that I couldn't see the source. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer was shadowing me out of curiosity. Maybe the wind was knocking loose branches down. But the pattern was wrong. The footsteps only happened when I walked. The instant I stopped to listen, the sound stopped, too. I tested it, pausing abruptly in the middle of the trail. Silence. I took one step forward. Crunch. A step right behind me. My stomach turned to ice. Someone was there, following me. The rational part of my brain started working overtime. Maybe it was another hiker? But why would they be creeping behind me without saying anything? If they wanted to pass me, they'd just call out. If they were hiking at my pace, I would have seen them by now. And if they were lost, they would have asked for help. I forced myself to keep walking, picking up my pace. My boots hit the dirt harder, faster, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound matched my steps, one for one, perfectly synchronized. I was too scared to turn around again. The forest felt wrong now, too quiet, too still. The towering pines and moss-covered branches, which had felt so peaceful this morning, now loomed over me like a prison. I was miles from anyone. No cell service. No roads. The nearest ranger station was a full day's hike away. If something happened to me out here, no one would find me. Then the sound changed. No longer just footsteps. Breathing. Faint but unmistakable. A slow, steady inhale and exhale. Too slow to be an animal. Too controlled. I walked faster. It walked faster, too. I broke into a jog. So did it. The breathing got louder. Closer. I ran. It ran, too. My backpack thumped against my shoulders, my legs burning as I sprinted down the trail. I wasn't thinking anymore. Just running. Fleeing. Branches whipped at my face. My breath came in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, the sound never fell behind. It was right there. Footsteps matching mine. Breathing matching mine. And then a laugh. A low, guttural chuckle. Just behind my right ear. I screamed. I don't know how long I ran. The trail blurred past in a smear of green and brown. I only stopped when my lungs felt like they would burst. I doubled over, gasping, eyes darting wildly across the forest. Silence. No footsteps. No breathing. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, trembling, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself I imagined the laugh. The panic had made me hear things, right? I forced myself to keep moving, but I didn't stop checking over my shoulder. Every few steps, I looked back. The feeling never left. Even though I couldn't hear it anymore, I knew it was still there. Watching me. Following me. By the time I reached my campsite for the night, it was nearly dark. I had planned to push further, but I was too exhausted. I built a fire, trying to shake off the lingering dread. The warmth helped a little. The light helped more. I cooked some food, forcing myself to eat even though my stomach was in knots. I told myself I was safe now. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the fire crackle outside. The forest was quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl. I was almost convinced it was all in my head. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. A sound. Soft. Close. Footsteps. Circling my tent. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, heart pounding against my ribs. The fire had burned down to embers. My knife was in my pack, just outside the tent. A twig snapped. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still. Then, after an eternity, silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I forced myself to step outside. I told myself I wouldn't see anything, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But the moment I looked down, my stomach turned to ice. Footprints. Fresh. Circling my tent. And they weren't mine. I didn't pack up. I didn't eat. I left everything except my GPS and my knife. I ran. I ran until my legs screamed. Until my vision blurred. Until I hit the nearest ranger station, bursting through the door, gasping for air. They found my camp later that day. All my gear was gone. Everything. Tent, backpack, food vanished. The only thing left. A single boot print. Right outside where my tent had been. I don't know who was out there that night. Or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I was never, ever alone.